and welcome to the Coalition for Juvenile Justice's webinar on Collaborating for Change, Addressing the Intersection of Juvenile Justice and Youth Homelessness. My name is Katie Mercier. I'm CJJ's Senior Associate for Conferences and Membership. I just wanted to run through a few technical details before we begin. First, you'll notice that all participants are in listen-only mode, which means that you are muted throughout the webinar. We will take questions at the end of the presentation, and you can ask a question in one of two ways. First, you can type your question into the questions box at any time throughout the presentation, or during Q&A, you can click the Raise Your Hand button. I will then call on you, unmute you, and you can ask your question verbally. I do ask that if you're on a cell phone that you use the questions box, as that it will avoid any audio feedback issues. We are recording this webinar, and the recording and the PowerPoint will be posted on CJJ's website within 24 hours. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our speakers today. Unfortunately, Naomi Smoot, who is CJJ's Senior Policy Associate, was scheduled to speak on this webinar, but she was unable to join us today, and so our Deputy Executive Director, Lisa Pilnick, will be filling in for her. Lisa helps lead reform efforts around homeless youth involved in the juvenile justice system at CJJ, status offenses, and other juvenile justice issues. She has authored dozens of publications on child and family issues and was one of the lead drafters of CJJ's national standards for the care of youth charged with status offenses. She is also the co-founder of Child and Family Policy Associates, a small consulting firm, and previously worked for the American Bar Association's Center on Children and the Law. Stacey Violente Cote is the Director of Teen Legal Advocacy Project at the Center for Children's Advocacy, which works directly with youth who are experiencing homelessness and those at risk for homelessness. Her work removes barriers that prevent youth from completing high school, addresses civil legal issues such as the educational rights of homeless students, special education advocacy, and the legal rights of immigrant youth. She supervises project attorneys who advocate for youth throughout Connecticut, and she manages the center's mobile legal office. She also chairs the Youth and Young Adult Homelessness Work Group of the Reaching Home campaign, the statewide campaign to prevent and end homelessness. And with that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Lisa.
Thanks so much, Katie, and thanks, Stacey, for joining us. I wanted to start by just giving a little bit of context and telling all of you about the project under which we're doing this webinar. So CJJ just recently launched Collaborating for Change, Addressing Youth Homelessness and Juvenile Justice, which is a project with two goals. One of the goals is to decrease the likelihood that homeless youth become involved with the juvenile justice system, and the other goal is to prevent youth homelessness among justice-involved youth. This project is undertaken with two great partners, the National Network for Youth and the National League of Cities Institute for Youth Education and Families, and it's very generously supported by the Rakes Foundation, the Tao Foundation, and the Melville Charitable Trust. So we want to thank those three funders very much for allowing us to be here with you and share this information. The project's work is also guided by an advisory committee comprised of over a dozen national, state, and local experts from a range of youth-serving sectors, and in addition to webinars like this one, we put out policy guidance and other tools and resources. So if you go to our Coalition for Juvenile Justice website, you can learn more about the project and also keep an eye out for new resources as they come out. So thanks again, and next slide, Katie. So I'm going to share some numbers with you about juvenile justice involvement and youth homelessness, but I want to start with the disclaimer that generally we don't have very good numbers, especially around youth homelessness. So as you'll see on this slide, each year 1 million children will have contact with the juvenile justice system. That's a pretty solid number, and you can break it down. Sometimes it's harder to find numbers on arrests, but court involvement numbers are pretty clear. If a young person goes to court, we know that they do, and there are records of that. When it comes to youth homelessness, there's a few complicating factors, one of which is what do you consider homelessness? So some people might count in their definition children who are sleeping on a friend's couch, for example, and we at CJJ use the broadest possible definition, which would include those types of children. Others might be thinking of more only children or young people who are sleeping on the street at night. There's also a question of maybe you do have somewhere to stay tonight, but you don't know where you're going to stay tomorrow. And so another complicating factor is that most young people won't say, oh yes, I'm homeless. And so you need to ask questions in a way that get at housing stability, but are sensitive to youth's needs and what they're willing to disclose, and also are just speaking to them in a way that they would understand. So with that being said, One of the numbers that we do use is an estimate from the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and their estimate is that in a year, 380,000 people younger than 18 will be homeless and alone for some period of time. And that doesn't include kids who are homeless with their families. So this is only unaccompanied homeless youth. And next slide, please, Katie. So again, it's hard to come up with exact numbers about what the overlap is between this population, but we do know that there is a significant overlap. We were very fortunate that in April, the Administration for Children, Youth, and Families released some really good data, and it looked at 654 youth in 11 cities, which is a pretty wide-ranging data collection, actually, for this population. And it looked at a lot of different things for runaway and homeless youth, but we've pulled out here for you the numbers that are most relevant to the juvenile justice system. So out of those young people, nearly 44% had stayed in jail, prison, or juvenile detention in the past. Almost 78% had had at least one interaction with police. Nearly 62% had been arrested. And I want to note that, that's one study, but it's similar to things that have been found. There have been a couple of studies in California, in Minnesota, that looked at populations that were more specific to those states or even to cities. Our project partner, National Network for Youth, did polling of its members who are runaway and homeless youth providers and asked them about their clients' experiences. And all of these different data collections have found very similarly high numbers of past justice involvement among homeless youth. Next slide, please. One thing I also want to note is that in both the justice system and in looking at youth who are homeless, we find that they are disproportionately more likely to be youth of color and disproportionately likely to be youth who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that means when we get to the solutions part of the discussion. Next slide, please. So I want to just talk very briefly about how these two things intersect in terms of juvenile justice leading to homelessness, homelessness leading to juvenile justice. Of course, we don't know all of the answers, and it's very different from one young person to another, but there are certain common themes that we see a lot. So, for example, there are young people who were homeless or were in unstable housing before they entered the juvenile justice system. So you may have kids who ran away from home because they were abused or neglected or were kicked out of their homes due to family conflict. And when you have already high levels of volatile family circumstances, and then you may have a child who leaves the home and then gets picked up for any one of a number of offenses, and we're going to talk a little bit more later about what the most common offenses we see are. But that child ends up in the juvenile justice system, and then when they leave, that family may not be willing to take them back either because of whatever the reasons they left were in the first place, or they just might feel like that child now coming out of a juvenile detention situation is sort of the last straw, and they're not willing to take that child back. So that's one thing that does come up a lot. And there was a report that came out in Washington State from Columbia Legal Services, and they talked about kids whose parents were just not willing to pick them up, or kids who said that they didn't know where they were going to go once they left the juvenile detention system. And I want to just pause one moment here. We're going to talk more about solutions later, but I think it's really important to just sort of remind everyone as we talk about this issue that whatever things are available or not available in your community for homeless youth, it may not, you may not have the best possible resources, and Stacey's going to talk a little bit more about some of the collaboration they did to improve, what was available for youth, but it's important to never lose sight of the fact that juvenile detention is just a terrible place for young people. There's a lot of other research, and it could be a whole webinar on its own, but juvenile detention leads to mental health, physical health, poor education outcomes, later criminal justice system involvement. It's very traumatizing for youth, and I don't want people to ever sort of make the mistake of thinking that being in a juvenile detention center in the first place or for longer than they need to be is a preferred alternative to homelessness, because that just can never be the answer. So going back to our sort of list of ways that these two things intersect, I think another thing that we see is even if a young person had somewhat stable housing before they went in, because there's so much disruption and poor employment outcomes for youth who've been in detention, they're less able to support themselves. And so that young person who exits at 17, at 18 may not be able to get a job, either because of their record or because they don't have the right education or they don't have vocational training. And similarly, there are some challenges related to public housing. So landlords, private landlords or public housing authorities may have limitations on what kind of housing you can have if you have a criminal record. And I think in some cases, HUD, which is the Department of Housing and Urban Development, has done a good job of trying to ease those restrictions, but I don't know that some of the guidance that they've put out there has really permeated the field yet. So there's still people who think that they can't house children or families when actually, in fact, they can. So that's sort of part of some of the solutions that we'll be talking about a little bit later. And again, we're going to talk more about solutions later, but I do want to just make the one point that thorough and well-developed transition plans and family-based services are really essential in making sure that youth are able to exit the justice system and that they exit with a safe, secure, and accessible place to live. Next slide, please. So I said before that we would talk a little bit about what some of the more common laws that we see violated or things that we see as sort of causation for children becoming involved with the juvenile justice system or becoming homelessness. So a few of those include quality of life ordinances. So those are things like anti-panhandling or not allowing youth to be in certain public spaces after dark. So sometimes they'll have anti-sitting or anti-camping type of ordinances. So all of those things are things that young people can be arrested and fined for. And so those are things that we see leading to justice involvement for people who just don't have anywhere safer that they can be. Similarly, survival crimes. When children don't have a safe and stable housing and don't have the money to meet their basic needs, they may resort to things like shoplifting, trespassing. They may be exploited either for labor trafficking or child sex trafficking. And just going back to the study that I mentioned earlier, which was released by the Administration for Children, Youth, and Families, that looked at several hundred kids, one of the things that the researchers remarked on specifically was that when they talked to these young people, they found that overwhelmingly, when these young people had been involved with the justice system, it was for what they termed survival crimes. So some of the things we're talking about. And again, family violence or behavioral health, either on the part of a young person or the parents, can all lead to the type of family instability that later leads to different types of offenses that get youth involved with the justice system. And we're going to talk a little bit more in a moment about status offenses, which are a type of offense that we see as very closely connected to homelessness. But I want to go back to that in just a minute. And we talked a little bit about the collateral consequences of justice system involvement. So sometimes people might think, okay, well, they were involved, they were detained for 6 months, but then that's it. And unfortunately, that's not the case. All of this justice system involvement has very long-term consequences for employment and ultimately for housing. Next slide, please. So as I said, we're going to talk a little bit about status offenses. For those who don't know what they are, status offenses are behaviors that violate the law but would not be an offense if committed by an adult. And one way that I try to describe them is they're only illegal because of your status as a minor. That's why they're called status offenses. So some of the common ones we see are truancy, running away, curfew, and liquor law violations, and something called ungovernability or unruliness, which also is defined in most states as being beyond the control of one's parents. So for all of these specific things, there are some that are a little more closely connected to homelessness than others, but obviously, curfew violations, if you say that juveniles can't be outside past a certain time and someone doesn't have a safer place to be, they're going to get picked up for that particular offense. Truancy may be more likely if a young person is staying, in different places every night and maybe they're not close to their home school. And, running away, there's, first of all, the act of running away, but also there's a lot of young people who were classified as runaways who may have actually been kicked out in the first place or may have run away really as a self-preservation technique because there are so many things going on in their home that are unsafe for them. So all of those young people may end up being homeless or may already be homeless and then become involved with the justice system as one of these status offenses. So you may have never heard of a status offense, and that may be because in different jurisdictions they're called different things. So if your jurisdiction has something called child in need of services, families in need of services, persons in need of services, those are all status offenses. However, different states deal with them differently. So in some cases, those might go through the child welfare system. And so that child might be classified as a child who has been maltreated and truly a child in need of services. And the child welfare system may be the one responding to them. In others, even with that child in need of services type label, it might actually be part of the juvenile justice system and going through delinquency proceedings in a similar way to actual acts that are delinquent acts that are committed, which would be an offense even if you were an adult. So generally this is controlled by state law, but the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, which is a federal juvenile justice law, does have some protections for status offenders. Unfortunately, the protection that it has right now basically says that you can't lock up status offenders, but there's a very large exception to that rule. So because of that, and we can go to the next slide, because of that, out of the over 100,000 children who have these types of cases every year, over 7,000 of them are detained each year. The good news is that the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act is being considered for reauthorization, and it looks like the reauthorization would include a phase out of that exception, which lets status offenders be locked up. The bad news is, where we are currently in the year, with the elections coming up and everything else, there's a lot that Congress has to deal with, and we just have to see if they're going to make it to the JJDPA this year, and if not, what will happen with it in the future. But that's a quick overview of status offenses, and I think we can go to the next slide. And I want to talk quickly about a few ways that we can address these challenges. I will say part of the reason that CJJ launched the project that we have on homelessness and juvenile justice is that we don't think that there are clear-cut answers. There are some certainly general guidelines that most experts would agree on, but in terms of how you actually carry out those steps, we think there's a lot to still be worked out, and that's part of what we're trying to do with our project. So with that disclaimer, I'll share a few sort of general points on how we can address these issues, and Stacy's going to talk a lot more about how these issues were addressed in Connecticut. So I think that one of the biggest things is identifying and working to meet youth's underlying needs. So every young person that becomes involved with the juvenile justice system or becomes homeless, there's things that are going on in their lives that are leading to the behaviors or the circumstances that you're seeing, and it's going to be different for each child, and therefore looking at what's going on in that particular young person's circumstance is going to be the major thing that you need to do as a first step before you can identify what services would be helpful to that child and their family. I think that we've got some good data, but I think there's always room for more research, and I think one of the things we're going to be hearing as part of the project that we're doing is what additional data people really think that they need in order to tackle this problem. So that's something that we're going to be looking at and sharing more information on, is just what other data is needed. Generally, awareness raising is very important, but also stakeholder training specifically for law enforcement, for judges, and for other first responders or system professionals that work with these youth. Prevention and diversion in general is really important, and luckily the juvenile justice system as a whole has been moving more towards diversion and less towards locking kids up, but I think it's very important that when you look at prevention and diversion opportunities, you're very specifically looking at, in addition to everything else, what the young person's housing situation is and how to get them into more stable housing, so that all of these other things can take and they really have an opportunity to take full advantage of these types of opportunities. I've said this before, but I will say it again, and I'm sure Stacy will say it as well. Transition planning is, the key thing for making sure that youth exiting the juvenile justice system don't exit to homelessness, and that transition planning, in some places there is transition planning, but it may not include housing. In other places there may not be very good transition planning to begin with. But looking at housing, education, employment, and family-focused services will all help. And it's also important just for me to reiterate here that although requiring transition planning is important, we need to be very careful that we don't sort of try to push for policies that just say you can't release young people into homelessness, because without that transition planning, all that will end up doing is leading kids to stay in these very terrible detention centers for even longer. So I think that advocacy is another really important point, and I don't mean by that big lobbying efforts, although those certainly have their place, but also when we were working on status offense issues, we saw that if you can convince someone to try a small pilot project or an agency-level policy change, those can have a small local impact, but all of the local jurisdictions tend to keep an eye on what the others are doing, and those ideas tend to spread pretty well once you've got a successful policy or pilot in place. It's a lot easier to then spread those out throughout the state. So they don't always need to be top-down changes. Sometimes they can be bottom-up. And then finally, it's really important to ensure that these efforts reach youth of color and LGBT youth, and also that youth are engaged in designing and implementing all of these solutions. So the last piece, I'm not going to talk about too much because it's much more of what we've hoped, what we've asked Stacy to focus on, but cross-system collaboration is really just essential in addressing this issue. And there are some great examples of state-level collaboration, and that's what Stacy's going to be talking about. And before I turn it over to her, we're going to do a quick poll. So you will see on your screen that we are asking to find out from you if you are currently involved in a coalition that addresses youth homelessness and or juvenile justice. And we want to know if you are involved in a coalition, if your coalition addresses both of those issues, just youth homelessness or just juvenile justice. And you can just click on it to vote, and then Katie will tally the results and report back out to us. And while everyone is voting, I want to just thank Stacy again for being on this webinar and sharing Connecticut's expertise and experiences with us. And I'm going to give just a moment for people to finish voting, and then I'm going to share the results and turn it over to Stacy. Okay, so I guess my guess is that this result comes a little bit from the fact that we're the Coalition for Juvenile Justice, so when we advertise a webinar, it goes to more JJ stakeholders and homelessness stakeholders, but I do see here that out of the people who responded, close to half had not been part of a coalition at all, but those who had been a part of a coalition were more likely to have been on a coalition that was addressing juvenile justice than homelessness or both. So thanks again for voting, and I'm going to turn it over to Stacy, and thank you again, Stacy, for sharing your expertise.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this webinar. For those who don't know about the Center for Children's Advocacy, we are a statewide legal organization fighting for the rights of Connecticut's most vulnerable children and youth. And as Katie mentioned in the beginning, we provide both individual advocacy as well as systemic advocacy across various systems. So my plan today will be to talk a little bit about this issue from a state-level view. And as I talk about youth and young adults, I just want to say up front that in general I'm talking about folks up through the age of 24, and our studies that I'll reference later really looked at youth and young adult homelessness up through the age of 24, and that would include obviously both the juvenile justice system and adult criminal justice issues, but more on that to come later. So I'll talk a little bit about and continue the conversation that Lisa started around the connection between juvenile justice and youth homelessness. And then in terms of looking at what we know at our state level and what we don't know, I'll talk about the data we have and where we have yet to go, and really give you a flavor for some of the ways we're coordinating and collaborating in Connecticut to better understand that juvenile justice and youth homelessness connection. Next slide, please, Katie. So as Lisa already talked about, really targeting the release from the juvenile justice system as a point to combat youth homelessness is an important place to look at this issue, both because it can address the young person and their ability to be stably housed, but also addressing some of the systemic issues of recidivism. Now, as Lisa pointed out, it's not that the time to start thinking about these issues of youth homelessness is not exactly when the person's being released, but planning early on for that release time from the juvenile justice system and having really workable and stable housing solutions is really critical. And that's also in the research from some of our national partners. So next slide, please. What we know about youth who are homelessness, many of you may already have some of this background information, but really a lot of concerns around the risk for sexual abuse, prostitution or trafficking, physical abuse, and then juvenile criminal justice involvement, illness, and suicide. And some of this is reflected in our state-level data that we've been able to gather here in Connecticut as well. I want to take a second here to just also point out the fact that while these are all concerning issues, we also at the statewide level really point out to our decision makers and policymakers that these are really expensive issues and that addressing housing stability can really address the costly trajectory that happens when our young people are experiencing all of these issues and are then having to get help from all of these various systems. Next slide, please. So to talk for a moment and about some of the peer-reviewed data and underscore some of the vulnerabilities that we've touched on already. From a sample of 10 studies spanning between 2006 and 2014, we know that about 50 to 75% of homeless youth had been arrested and 50 to 60% had actually been incarcerated. And not surprisingly, issues of drug abuse, mental health issues, and lack of access to services are associated with the increase in criminal activity for homeless youth. Next slide, please. We also know that the longer that somebody is experiencing homelessness or disconnected, it gives a greater likelihood of increased criminal justice involvement. And that's really critical when we talk a little bit later about what kind of services are available for young people in your state or in our case in Connecticut for access to crisis services. And it really also connects with some of what Lisa talked about earlier about some of the survival crimes that young people might be engaging in because the longer that they're disconnected, the more likelihood of having to get involved in some of those crimes. And we know from the data that some of the most effective services are housing, which I'm going to talk about, employment, and behavioral health supports. Next slide, please. So specifically thinking about the use of housing stability and addressing housing stability to reduce recidivism, we in Connecticut have a model for addressing the issues of recidivism and the use of crisis or emergency systems in the adult population who had criminal justice involvement. And this comes from our friends at the Corporation for Supportive Housing who had worked to really show that connection and worked and have this project called Connecticut Collaborative on Reentry. And if you'd like to know more about that, there's plenty of information on the Corporation for Supportive Housing's website. And This is a project that was done in New Haven, Hartford, Waterbury, and Southeast Connecticut, and it's a data-driven project targeting supportive housing in effort to reduce recidivism and public sector costs and improve individual health and social outcomes. It targeted those who cycle through the homeless service and corrections systems. And as you can see on the slide, the outcomes were really impressive. There was a 99% decrease in homeless shelter stays and also a 73% decrease in jail episodes. And so we're really looking at how can these kinds of collaborations be used to address youth homelessness in our state, and looking at some of the examples that have been done, like this one. Next slide, please. So how are we addressing youth homelessness in Connecticut? Well, Connecticut launched the Reaching Home campaign in 2012, which is our version of the federal Opening Doors plan. And for those who may not be involved in the homeless sector, that's the federal plan to prevent and end homelessness. And Connecticut adopted that plan and set goals for ending different areas of homelessness for different sectors, and has met the goal to end veteran homelessness in Connecticut. And Connecticut is also on track to end chronic homelessness this year. Our goal is to end youth homelessness by the year 2020, and that was very recently changed so that we would be in line with the federal plan. Although we launched our plan in Connecticut 2 years after the federal plan came out, we really feel like we can make progress on this and match our goals with the federal goals. So we will be moving ahead and on track to end youth homelessness in Connecticut by 2020. Next slide, please. Since the purpose of my piece of this webinar is to talk a bit about collaboration, I really wanted to spend some time on this slide to give you a sense of how that collaboration has served in Connecticut and how it works. So this is the Reaching Home campaign, the campaign to end homelessness in Connecticut. And what I would tell you is that when I've talked with folks from other states about this campaign, folks really have been able to look at these levels and structures to think about how they might be able to address really any particular issue in their state or county or city, and have used these structures and modified them to meet their needs. So I'll take a minute to go through what some of the pieces of the structure are, because I really think it's critical to the success of that Connecticut has found in other areas of ending youth homelessness, and really critical to the collaboration. The Reaching Home campaign is staffed and managed by one agency in Connecticut, which is not my agency, but the Partnership for Strong Communities. And the partnership has staff to really make all of this happen. And the highest level here, as you can see on the slide, is the Reaching Home Steering Committee. And that committee governs the campaign and provides oversight on the implementation of the entire framework. And it's a body through which consensus is reached on policy changes, on timing, and provides a reach across multiple institutions and systems necessary to make change. There's more than 15 agencies, and several continuums of care are represented, and many of the folks on the steering committee also participate in some of the work groups. The next level is really the coordinating committee, and that is envisioned as the leadership coalition to ensure that the steering committee meetings are well planned and executed, and assist the working groups in its work plans, gaining access to information and data and resources to accomplish their work. And then, as you can see on the bottom of the slide, there are 6 work groups which help to advance the issues identified and think about really focus areas and provides guidance around what's happening at the local level. And it really works to advance key strategies, and in particular includes people with lived experience. So I chair the Youth and Young Adult Homelessness Work Group, and we have youth who have experienced homelessness, youth who've been involved in the juvenile justice system, youth who are LGBTQ, who participate at the work group level and also in some subgroup work, so that we make sure that the work reflects what's happening on the ground. Okay, next slide, please. So how we're addressing youth homelessness in Connecticut, I give you here some of the major highlights of the work as it's gone on. In 2013, the youth work group launched the Invisible No More study with Yale Consultation Center, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that and some of the data we got from that in some of the next few slides. But that was really our first look at some of the data in Connecticut, and that really gave us a needs assessment of what was happening, and we were able to really document some of the experiences of youth who'd been experiencing homelessness. Because I don't know about other people's states, but in our state, we found that policymakers really weren't seeing youth homelessness and really didn't understand the complexity of it. We are a state where young people who are experiencing homelessness are sleeping on other people's couches and moving from place to place, and they're really not visible, hence the title Invisible No More. And so this really gave us a look into the systems, and I would say also really helped us to engage each of the systems in a more substantive way when they were able to get a little bit of data. We then launched our youth plan and in 2014, and you see on your screen here some of the cute little icons that really pertain to the areas that we plan address in our plan, including tools to identify, screen, and refer youth in need, expanding direct services and support along the housing continuum, providing or improving training and technical assistance for providers, improving collection and use of data, and advocating for changes in policy. You'll also see at the end of the presentation today there's a link to look at the full plan that we utilize in Connecticut. And then in 2015, we had our first statewide count of homeless youth, and I'll talk about some of that data in some of the next few slides as well. But that was really the first time where we were able to get our hands around an estimate of how many youth are experiencing homelessness in our state and what systems they're touching at what percents. And then at this point in 2016 and moving forward, we're really implementing the first phase of those strategies I outlined and working toward that goal of ending youth homelessness by 2020. Next slide, please. So I talked to you about that study, Invisible No More, and that it's really a needs assessment where we interviewed 98 youth, almost 100, not quite there, up through the age of 24, and conducted key informant interviews as well as focus groups. In particular, one focus group with staff from our Court Support Services Division of our judicial branch, who oversees pretrial services, family services, probation, supervision, as well as juvenile residential centers, including juvenile detention in our state, and also contracts with agencies in the community delivering treatment and other support services. So from the study, we know that we have a good amount of our youth who are experiencing homelessness who also receive special education services, who have dropped out of school, and 53% who had had contact with our child welfare agency. In Connecticut, our child welfare agency is the Department of Children and Families, and first thing we asked is if they had had contact with child welfare, and then we know 37% had been removed from home by child welfare. Next slide, please. In the same study, we know that almost 50% had moved 6 times in their lifetime, and 50% had been arrested at least once. As well, we have almost 40% who reported incarceration in jail, prison, detention, or a residential facility. So this mirrors what we knew nationally and some of what Lisa pointed out, that our homeless youth are really experiencing and touching our juvenile justice system, as well as in our state, we know for sure the contact with the child welfare system as well. Next slide, please. And what you see here is some very concerning early and unsafe sexual activity that we know is going on among this population. So we know there's a high level of sexual activity happening with an average of 5.6 sexual partners. We get very concerned that 23.5% of the youth who were surveyed had first experienced sexual intercourse by age 12 or younger. And we also get very concerned that almost 20% reported trading sex for money, place to stay, or drugs or alcohol. And so what we're really talking about is quantifying some of the sex trafficking that's happening in our state. Okay, next slide, please. So then in 2015, as I mentioned earlier, we did our first statewide count of youth experiencing homelessness. And this occurred in Connecticut alongside our point-in-time count. So for those of you who are not familiar with the homeless system, there is a night one time every year where homelessness is counted all across the country. And it has a certain methodology that gets at people who are in shelters or staying on the streets. And sadly, in our state, this count had never really captured youth who were experiencing homelessness, particularly not youth who are on their own. And so we developed a special methodology. I think last year in our state, well, I guess I should say the year before the time we did the homeless youth count, there were about 11 young people who were found to be homeless. And when we designed the methodology to really get at those young people who are couch surfing, who are staying with friends or relatives for short periods of time, who are trading sex for a place to stay, we came to find out that we had an estimated 3,000 homeless or housing unstable youth in our state. And this came from a self-report. We also know that about a third have history of involvement with Department of Children and Families, and that youth involved with our child welfare system were 6 times more likely to be involved with the criminal justice system. So again, this mirrors the earlier needs assessment that we had done, and then also the some of the national data that we spoke of earlier. Next slide, please. In particular, regarding youth involved with the criminal justice system, we learned that they were 5 times more likely to have moved 2 or more times in the last 6 months, and 3 times more likely to be living outside or in a place not meant for human habitation. So again, very vulnerable and really concerning data that we were able to find. Next slide, please. This slide really just breaks out for you some of the age groups and the number of youth surveyed and the number who were juvenile justice involved. I won't go through and read all of the categories to you. You can feel free to look through that on your own. But I will point out that we're at the lowest at about 20%, 20.5% I think it is, for the youngest age group, up through 24% of the young people who were JJ involved or criminal justice involved at the age of 22 to 24. So this really breaks down for you some of the age groups. Next slide, please. So what are we doing in Connecticut to address youth homelessness, and particularly in the area of juvenile justice? Well, we know we need to collect and utilize better data. We have large gaps in our housing continuum that needs to be addressed, and we really need to integrate housing solutions into the discharge planning that happens from our systems, including child welfare and juvenile justice. So if you go to the next slide, I'll talk for a moment about how we are working to collect better data. We really want to be able to regularly and accurately count and then assess, as we do with other populations, through the data that's collected by the Homeless Management Information System or the point-in-time count that I referenced earlier. We know that with other populations we've been able to assess progress through this data, but first really having regularized counts so that we can then have a baseline to really assess our progress is really important. And then identifying homelessness and housing instability just as people enter into state systems. We need to be able to know that as they come in, and then also know that prior to exiting our state systems. That gives us a sense right when they come in of how important that transition planning is that Lisa also spoke about, and really be thinking about that early on so that at the point of discharge from the system we have a plan in place that will make sense and reduce any chance for homelessness and housing instability. And then we'd really like to be able to share data across our systems to better understand and target interventions. So for example, we would like to know exactly when our juvenile justice youth are experiencing homelessness. Is it immediately upon release from the system? Is it within a month of release from the system, or within a year of release from the system? Well, if we're getting data from the various systems that they're touching and sharing that across, we'll know which systems these kids are touching and get a better insight into what that experience of homelessness looks like. So see, these are some of the pieces we're working on with regard to data right now. Next slide, please. What I just want to say here is that our housing continuum in Connecticut is for youth and young adults is really inadequate. And we have one state-funded program called the Homeless Youth Program, which is a very small amount of funding. It's currently housed in our Child Welfare Department, but is legislatively planned to move to our Department of Housing in the coming legislative session. We are just not a state where we have enough emergency options for youth experiencing homelessness, whether that's for young people under 18 or 18 and older. And we really, without access to safety, we know that all of the terrible things we spoke about earlier in this webinar are really bound to happen, because as I said earlier, the longer people are disconnected, the more likely not only of criminal justice involvement, but also increase in some of the terrible experiences and more costly systems usage. So access to crisis options is really critical. And then looking at models that might, for some of our youth who might need longer-term housing supports, what might that look like? And then some who may just need what we call a medium or short-term support to be able to get stably housed. So that's really filling out the whole continuum from crisis to medium to long-term supports. And that's an area where we're really working in Connecticut to expand those supports. Next slide, please. With our juvenile justice partners, we're really looking to develop comprehensive statewide multi-system recommendations to assure that young people are not released into unstable living situations. Again, we really need to be able to institutionalize the transition planning so that young people have adequate plans for when they leave the systems, and that we're really doing that right when they enter our systems. And in Connecticut, we are doing this with a coalition of folks that are on the work group. If you remember the slide I showed earlier about the different levels, the work group at the bottom of that slide includes folks who are both serving juvenile justice youth as an agency, and then state agencies who are administering the programs. And then we're also working with a legislatively created body that includes legislators and state agency folks and providers to address some of these youth homeless issues amongst the JJ population. And next slide, please. I thought it might be helpful for folks to just really put out there that there are challenges of doing all of this coordination, and I think it's important to talk about those so people can first feel that if you're experiencing these challenges, you're not alone, and also as you may embark on doing some of these coalitions, knowing what you're getting into. Of course, I think for all of us, doing collaboration and cross-system work, there's always funding challenges. And ideally, we want to build up our system's capacity to address the needs of these young people, but this is really hard in tough budget climates. And for instance, in Connecticut, our state agencies just experienced significant funding cuts, in particular our juvenile justice and criminal justice agencies. So that is part of the factor of what we have to look at. And so we're really looking at both federal dollars that might help to support some of our work, and where current state resources can come together and collaborate to address some of the work that we need to be doing. When you are embarking on an issue that doesn't have quite enough research, as Lisa pointed out, there's lots of research that still needs to be done. You're really learning while doing, and really making choices and decisions based on the best available research, and in some cases really trying to create some research, and that can be challenging. And then as you do this, I think the last point is, as you do this cross-system education and engagement, you're really moving a lot of people together at the same time, and really needing a variety of state agency staff at the table. And this can be really time-consuming work, a lot of communication that has to happen across different agencies and in work group meetings and at that 3 levels that I discussed earlier, the work group, the steering committee, and the coordinating committee. And so it is a good amount of time commitment. But we really feel we've been able to make headway as the examples of ending veteran homelessness and soon chronic homelessness in our state, so that we really feel that ending youth homelessness and addressing the needs of our juvenile justice youth who are experiencing homelessness really benefit from this collaboration and time commitment. So I think my last slide is just if you'd like more resources about what's happening in Connecticut. I'm there. Also, one of my major partners, who is the executive director of the agency who staffs that Reaching Home campaign that I've been speaking about. Her contact information is here, as well as the youth plan that I referenced earlier. And then lastly, a website that our collaborators have created to give youth a place to go to get more information and resources about youth homelessness. So thank you again for having me on this webinar, and happy to take any questions people may have.
Okay, thank you so much. So just as a reminder about Q&A, you can type your question into the questions box at any time, or you can click the raise your hand button and I can call on you, unmute you, and you can ask your question verbally. I do ask if you're on a cell phone that you use the questions box so that we can avoid any audio feedback issues. While I am waiting for the questions to come in, I'd like to point out that we have the presenter's information right there on your screen. If you require a certificate of completion, you can just shoot me an email, and you can also email Audrey to be put on our mailing list for future information about future webinars. So the first question is, what can public schools do to help combat this issue?
I'd be happy to talk about that for a moment. This is Stacy. I know in Connecticut, we've really been looking at identifying students who are experiencing homelessness in schools. And at full disclosure, Connecticut was recently found to be one of the worst states in this area, which I think is important to say because we were ranked 49th in the country in identifying and educating homeless students in a 2015 study from the Institute for Children, Poverty, and Homelessness. But that data has really helped us to think about what are we going to do about this. Because when students are identified in schools, then the local schools can really work with local providers as well as work on statewide groups or county-wide groups to address the issue. And I know here in Connecticut, our work group really involves education folks to help figure out what are some of the solutions to ending youth homelessness, how is it playing out in particular school districts, and how can we utilize school districts to spread the word and really bring awareness. Folks on the call may or may not be aware of the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, which requires every school district in the country to have a homeless liaison, as well as every state to have a statewide homeless liaison. And our statewide homeless liaison sits on our work group, and our state agency sits on the steering group of that Reaching Home campaign that I spoke about. And we utilized some of the resources to put together that website that I mentioned, which has youth resources right on it. It's youth-help.org, and it was on one of the last slides that I showed about Connecticut resources. And on there is also a series of videos that we put together about the legal rights of students who are experiencing homelessness. And so that collaboration between the public school system, us as advocates, and our state education department and homeless advocates, we all really came together to create this toolkit that now school districts can use to educate their students about the legal rights of these young people experiencing homelessness, and folks in the community agencies can use that toolkit and the resources that we put on that website to really help them understand what the legal rights are of students who are experiencing homelessness. And so I think it's another example where collaboration really resulted in a specific resource that was developed. One other example I would point out is that working with our school folks and our providers, we identified in our state a problem that homeless youth were experiencing, which was being able to access their birth certificates. If they were under 18, our state law limited access to a birth certificate. If you're under 18, and young people had to have an adult or a specific list of other people who could access their birth certificate for them. And this was really problematic for school folks, both in having birth certificates, but also in getting youth hooked up to other services in the community, including job training programs. So the school folks and agency folks really helped us to advocate to change that law in our state so that young people who are on their own, which we call unaccompanied homeless youth, can access their birth certificate, and their school homeless liaison can bring them down to get their birth certificate at the requisite office. And so that's another example where that collaboration really helped us to identify a problem and advocate for a change to that problem in our state.
I think we have one more time, or question for, wow, we have time for one more question, and that's how might school districts work to help inform transition planning?
So Stacy, do you want to answer that one, or would you like me to throw out some ideas?
Why don't you start, and I am happy to add some.
Sure, and since this question is sort of related to the last one, I'm going to throw out a few more ideas for that one as well. So I think that, you know, as Stacy mentioned, there's this law, the McKinney-Vento Act, and it really does provide some good resources for youth who are identified as homeless. But the bigger issue, or just one issue that sort of prevents us from fully being able to benefit from that law, is the fact that not all youth are going to be identified as homeless. So I would say, just as Stacy was speaking to collaboration, it would be really great to have a little bit more training of school professionals about how to spot the signs of homelessness. And I don't know, I mean, there are sort of big national organizations that work on this issue, but I think you could start at the local level by reaching out to your local homelessness provider and seeing if they can come in and talk to your staff about how to spot the signs of homelessness, how to talk to youth about it, and then what to do once they've identified this as an issue. In terms of the transition planning, I think it's sort of similar in that if you call your juvenile justice agency and you say, we recognize that this is a problem among our population and among yours, what can we do, how can we work together, that's a really important first step. I think that one of the reasons that young people do end up homeless is because often of the educational disruption and the quality of education that they're getting when they're in juvenile detention centers. So I think that to the extent schools can work with justice agencies to, first of all, minimize disruption, but also to improve the quality of education within facilities. If kids do have to be in a detention facility and can't be diverted, if they can return to a school setting, get their diploma, and sort of have that under their belt, they will be much more likely to be able to support themselves in the future and not end up homeless. Stacey probably has some other ideas as well, and then we probably need to call it a day. But I did want to add quickly before I turn it back to Stacey that my contact information is up there, and please do feel free to follow up with me directly with any questions.
Thanks, Lisa. I would just add that an issue that we see quite often is facilitating the transfer of credits from youth who are transitioning out of a juvenile justice placement to their home community, and making sure that there's a system in place and that youth are getting access to their credits that they might have earned while they were in a juvenile justice placement, and that transfer is seamless and doesn't cause a delay, so that young people, when they return, are in the exact classes that they should be in, and that their education isn't disrupted in that way. As well, I know I said only one thing, but I just thought of one more point, which is that ensuring the process for young people re-entering into their school is something that youth and families and providers know what the laws are around that in your community, and that students aren't unnecessarily kept out of their school related to issues that might have arisen with their juvenile justice commitment. And so those re-entry issues and where they're going to go to school and who they go to, and ensuring that there's not a delay in that process, so that young people are not getting further juvenile justice involvement because they're not in school when they've been released, and or having disruption in their housing, because when they're not in school and they're home and there may be behavioral problems, those get exacerbated by the fact that they're not in school during the day. So I too have my information here on the slide and would be happy to answer any questions that others may have via email.
Okay, and that concludes CJJ's webinar. Thank you so much to both of our presenters for speaking today. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded, and the recording and the PowerPoint will be posted on CJJ's website within 24 hours. That concludes our webinar, so thanks everyone for joining us.